Hey, Chike, we're
Hello,
back.
hello. Okay, let's do it. So, Ling, from what you were saying, you touched on policy as one side of diversity and inclusion, and you also touched on culture. And you were going back to Brown versus Board of Education, and how, yes, we passed this law and made these rules that requires us to integrate our public schools, and
Mhm.
yet it took us almost 2 decades for us to actually achieve or come close to achieving that intended policy. Can you just go ahead and just finish your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, my point in bringing up that example is just that it takes time, right, for people to adjust to a new way of life, right? That desegregation of schools was a major transition in America. And a lot of people were very uncomfortable, wildly uncomfortable with it. And so, and it literally took the government sending in law enforcement to make sure people did comply with this new law. Just taking a look at Juneteenth, right? Why do we celebrate Juneteenth? I mean, that was 2.5 years that 250,000 slaves in the state of Texas did not know that they were in fact free, right? That's why well, I try to refrain from using the word celebrate when we talk about Juneteenth, but just commemorating that historical event. So again, when it comes to policy, your original question, why are we still having these conversations? When people feel like, oh, everything is open, it's legal for Black people to own property in America now. Why don't they? What's the problem? So again, it takes time, right, for individuals, for the community to adjust to any major cultural shift that is started with policies,
Right.
right? And so, patience. But again, going back to diversity, equity, inclusion, officers and leaders, like, their role is to work on mitigating those invisible barriers to success that oftentimes come in the form of racial bias, gender bias, elitism, ageism, ableism, all of these things. And they exist around us. Sometimes we are aware of them, sometimes we're completely unconscious of them. And so, again, it's a continued learning journey. We continue to learn, continue to work towards truly achieving that equitable society that we all hope for.
Thank you so much for all of that insight. As you were talking, I don't know if you're familiar with this character, Katherine Johnson. There's this movie about her, The Hidden Figures.
Yes,
Uh,
yeah, of course.
yeah, so it kind of comes to mind. She is in this workspace, and sometimes when we think about the first man on the moon, based on the historical anecdotes, it's hard to imagine that a Black woman, was instrumental in helping that mission succeed. So when
Critical
right,
role.
right. But however, from your description, when given a conducive environment to work with, even with simple things like, hey, coffee within range and
Yes,
bathroom that
a
was not a mile
bathroom. Yeah,
away, and so on, she was able to compete in a male-dominated world. So
yes,
sometimes the issue is not necessarily policy. Yes, the policy is in place, but we all, both as an institution and as individual at a very individual level, have to be actively engaged in changing our culture and making sure that we are more inclusive and we are more equitable, especially within our workplaces. Does that sound right?
agreed. And it starts with policy, right? And then comes compliance,
Right,
right? And accommodations, right? Making sure that we have bathrooms
right,
that
right.
are accessible, right? Basic needs like that play a critical role in setting up an employee or any individual for success, right? To perform at their best. And it could be something as simple as that. You know, One of my favorite scenes in that movie is when her boss, her senior, starts knocking down the sign of
Uh-huh.
the what is it,
Right.
colored only or whites only bathroom. And it's interesting that is such a significant part of that whole film, because you start to see doors opening, or you start to see our white counterparts complying when they start to see the impact exclusionary practices have on their own success, right? He wanted her there to, to contribute to what, right? And when it started to cause a disruption in his work, then he got on board, right? And again, not to say that, it's not a negative observation of him that he ignored this all this time, but, people are busy and sometimes you're just completely unaware of it. If you are not experiencing certain forms of discrimination directly, oftentimes it's not top of mind, So I share that in an effort to encourage everyone to be patient, right? Oftentimes we don't discriminate against people intentionally, it's just not our own personal experience. And so it's not top of mind. We're not really thinking about it, which is why we need to open up these conversations and say, look, this is holding me back, right? This is something, if given, I could actually accelerate this process, right? And when we could do that across all levels of any given organization, that is a high performance organization, And so it's about effectiveness, efficiency, high performance. Those are things that every leader in the public or private sector cares about,
Okay, so Swilling, on that note, I think you kind of like touched on that on this issue a little bit, but what are some of those unintended consequences of maintaining a less inclusive or equitable economy with regards to any industry? And we've just talked about NASA and the journey to the moon, but outside of that movie and in a broader context, what are some of those unintended consequences? And you also said, hey, let's be patient. For some of us, for some people who are on the other side of equity and inclusion, be more patient. What are also some of those consequences or effects of maybe not having patience sometimes?
That is such a great question. So another way that I define diversity, equity, and inclusion in the corporate arena in particular, it is a business strategy. It's a business imperative, right? What it is capitalizing on the full value of your human capital and looking at assets. We talk a lot about assets and asset management in the banking industry, obviously. Generally, we're talking about financial assets, but I would be the first person to argue your greatest asset for any organization in any industry is your people, right? Take a look at all of the assets you have as an organization and take people out of the equation. And what do you have, right? What's left? In a bank, it's a big pile of money, right? But a big pile of money is meaningless if you don't have people there to serve as stewards for that financial capital, right? To invest that, to put it to use, to bring it to life, essentially. And so that is why it's so important to just be on board with this. And you say, what are the unintended consequences? Well, I mean, you are going to miss out on capitalizing on those talents, right? On generating high levels of creativity, innovative thought in your organization. Being an organization's ability to do that is essentially their, how do I want to describe this? Industry leaders know how to do that well.
Right.
And that keeps them at the top of their game, right? At the forefront of their industry. And so really when you have an engaged workforce, a highly, just again, creating opportunities to really get your human capital to perform at your best is the goal, right? And the unintended consequences are only capitalizing on a fraction of that, right? There's so much talent, so much ideas, insight, expertise that organizations are still falling short of fully capitalizing on,
Right.
right? And it's because employees are just one foot in, one foot out. You know what I mean? I think everybody's had a job where you're like, you're kind of dragging your feet to work and you're not really motivated or inspired to be, you're basically there for a paycheck, right? You're looking at the clock, when is it time to roll, right? Those are all characteristics of organizations that are failing to capitalize on the full value of their human capital, versus, people who are just can't wait to get to work. They're not even looking at the clock. They're working 10, 12-hour days, and it feels like they're pursuing their passion. It's not a burden, right? They're excited about it. And, those are the types of leaders, individuals, organizations, cultures that I want to be a part of. I mean, how about you?
Definitely. Definitely.
Increased retention, the culture is healthy and thriving. I mean, those are the types of places that, and I'll also say this, those are the types of organizations that are extremely diverse, right? They have built inclusive cultures, right? All of these goals that we have as diversity, equity, inclusion, leaders, consultants, officers, whatever you want to call us, are being met, right? Are being achieved. And so it goes hand in hand.
That's awesome. So as a follow up on to that, what kind of specific trainings are in place to ensure that bank employees engage with all people in a fair and just manner?
That is a great question. I love that you use the term training, because I generally refrain from using the term training. It's very intentional. Now, if you are in the workplace, right, you're an employee in an organization, you hear the term training, what immediately comes to mind? Are you excited about it?
Not necessarily. I'm thinking PowerPoints, time to eat some donuts and just pass out while someone is standing out there just talking about whatever.
Exactly. Oftentimes people are like, okay, it's mandatory.
Yep.
This is something I have to do. Oftentimes people are dragging their feet to trainings,
Right.
and again, it doesn't necessarily foster that excitement, inspiration, motivational kind of experience for employees. So instead, I like to use the term conversation or learning experience, right? We are all here to learn, right? And one thing that I use at the bank and also in my consulting firm, it's 3 stages, right? I listen, I learn, I lead. Now, the best leaders start off as the best listeners first. And especially when it comes to sensitive topics in the workplace, like a lot of diversity, equity, inclusion topics. I mean, we're talking about people here, right? People are sensitive. And sometimes people take things personal, even in a professional setting. And so there's a lot of sensitivities that you have to be mindful of. One of the most effective, highly effective ways to build trust is to be a good listener, which is why the most highly effective leaders are good listeners first. And so when it comes to mitigating biases in the workplace, it is important for employees to learn, and leaders, management, everyone across the board, to listen first. And in that order, I listen, and then I learn, and then I lead, right? And whatever you hear in that listening stage informs the manner in which you lead. And so across the bank, we host a lot of, I call them I-learning experiences and conversations. An overwhelming majority of my work is building, as I alluded to earlier, social capital, right? Social capital is the relationships that we have, the trust that we build with one another. And so social capital, I would say, is the most important currency in America today, because we have a lot of money. Money's generally not a problem, but even in politics, I've seen if you could have all the money in the world, but if you don't have trust with that leader, with that agency, with that organization, with that group of people, they're not going to play with you, right? They're not going to do business with you. So I would argue social capital is where our focus needs to be right here in America. And so again, going back to trainings and learning experiences, as I call them, sitting down, just having conversations, hosting, facilitating conversations with groups of people across your organization is how you, again, build trust across differences. You expose your colleagues to something different, to something new. And in turn, that strengthens their minds, right? I oftentimes refer to the work that I do as being in the business of opening hearts and strengthening minds. And, you know, many of us, we don't intentionally step into opportunities or teams or projects meaning to offend or exclude or discriminate against certain groups of people. But sometimes that's what happens. So again, exposure to those perspectives and experiences of being discriminated against is so important for all of us to know so that we don't continue to create those types of experiences for ourselves and other colleagues, you know. And so this has been, in my experience, a more effective way to move the needle, right, on learning, just simply hosting conversations. And you know, it's a much more friendlier term. You know, I'd rather just sit down and have a conversation rather than drag my feet to go to a training, you know.
So on that note, do you think that the needle has moved, whether left or right, in the last 5 years
In America
in
or
America?
in the organization that I work in or
Yeah, I'll say in our society at large, in
in
America as
society?
a whole.
Yeah, in society at large, absolutely. I feel like the needle is being moved every day. And that's what I see, right? It's also important to recognize why and understand why some people may feel like it's not moving, you know? Um, and I admit, I live a pretty comfortable, privileged life here in Utah, the role that I play in the organization that I work for, the community that I'm currently serving in. And so my experience can feel very positive, optimistic, hopeful, because I'm working with people who are um, you know, oftentimes in that same mindset and share a similar experience to me, you know, which is why it's so important. This is one of the reasons why I really admire my current boss right now, Scott Anderson. He's president and CEO of Zions Bank, because he never forgets the people who may not um, be living so comfortable, right? Utah, for example, we have the strongest economy in the nation right now, Utah and Idaho. Crazy, right? Utah is number 5 in terms of asset management in the country. Our financial services industry runs deep and wide. It is extremely diverse. We have the lowest unemployment rate. You know, so based on the numbers, Utah's doing really well, and we are well positioned to recover from the pandemic, right? But there are still families across the state of Utah who are struggling to make ends meet. And there are a number of bears that are facing. And so, you know, I really find it, I'm a privilege to work with so many leaders who are always continuously mindful of those families. I'm trying to figure out ways in which we can remove barriers to success for them so that they can all succeed, right? One thing I also want to note in this conversation is the Utah Compact on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Now, Zions Bank was a founding signatory for the compact. It was officially signed by Governor Herbert right before the end of his second term, back in December of last year. We held this press conference on Capitol Hill. We had community leaders from across all communities, multicultural, public, private sector, on the steps of the Capitol, you know, honoring this document. And the purpose of that document is to really set the tone, the stage for our entire state to build inclusive cultures, inclusive environments across all levels of society. And there are 4 policy priorities outlined in the Utah Compact on racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. Number 1 is education, and number 2, employment, number 3, housing, and number 4 is healthcare. So Chike, going back to earlier in this conversation, defining what economic inclusion actually is, it spans much more than just a family or individual's economic status in society, right? It's education, employment, housing, and healthcare. And especially coming out of this pandemic that we just all experienced for over a year and a half now, healthcare is top of mind, right? Mental health and physical health. And I think we both know it just takes one catastrophic health crisis in a family to completely change their economic status in society. So health, we have to invest in positive health outcomes, quality of care, access to quality of care. And then going back to the very beginning, education, we have to open up doors and access for individuals to pursue or receive high quality education. That is what sets up people for success. So it's a myriad of ways to come at economic inclusion. It has to be comprehensive. It has to be widespread, broad, and deep, right? So we believe a good place to start is by those 4 policy priorities. And we track what we call community bills during each legislative session and support, whatever pieces of legislation may open up doors for the most vulnerable populations in our communities on those 4 topics, right? And so it's really, really important for all organizations to recognize that piece of it.
That's wonderful, Suiling, and very insightful, especially mentioning the Utah Compact. I am not very familiar with it, but from your description, I think it's one of those documents I'll probably have to, have on my bedside and have a good night read one of these evenings.
Yes, and I want to invite everybody to go and sign on to it. So you can sign on as an organization or as an individual. It's currently housed at the Salt Lake Chamber. So you just go to their website, type in Utah Compact, Racial Equity, Diversity, Inclusion. It'll pop up, and then you just can electronically sign it from there.
That's awesome. Okay, so it's getting late, almost time to let you go. But I still have one last.
Fast.
Yeah, you go. Well, when you're having good conversation, you kind of lose track of time.
Yeah.
So that's good.
I hear you.
So in conclusion, is there anything that those of us who are not bankers should be doing to help increase economic inclusion within our own communities, within the walls of our own homes, in our own individual capacities?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, so much. I just want to go back to those 3 key pieces. I listen, I learn, I lead. We all have the capacity to listen, right? It's just about making it a priority. When it comes to learning, as I continue to engage with a lot of multicultural communities, and we're in the culture in our society right now is people are sensitive, right? And that some people just don't even want to deal with you if you are not on board with this social justice movement, right? And so one thing that I have heard a lot of people talking about is if you're not doing the work, and oftentimes that work, the learning, the educating falls on the backs of communities of color as well. So it's like we have to experience these racial disparities, racial injustices, and then we have to teach people about it. And then we have to educate them and bring them along. This is what you need to do. I mean, that's exhausting, right? I'm sure you're familiar with these things called fatigue or exhaustion, and so I encourage all of our listeners to take it upon yourself to do the work and educate yourself. Read those history books, understand why we're in the predicament in which we're in right now, so that we don't have to continue to repeat, these historical experiences and events that we have endured as a country, as a nation. One thing I just want to note, because we just concluded it, Utah, one of my favorite organizations is YWCA Utah. Their goal or their mission is to eliminate racism and empower women. I currently serve on the board of the Real Women Run program at YWCA. And so I work very closely with a lot of the women leaders there. Two of our executives at Zions Bank serve on their board of directors. And YWCA just launched what they call the 2021 21-day Racial Equity Social Justice Challenge. And for 21 days, organizations could sign up and receive learning resources every single day on different topics related to racial equity and social justice. And we as a bank, as an organization, took it upon ourselves to take on this challenge. And I hosted weekly conversations at the bank talking about the different lessons and that we had learned, the reflections, aha moments that we had as colleagues. And it was so helpful. Even for me, who's been doing this work for over 20 years, there's always opportunity to learn something new, to deepen our understanding about XYZ, right? So I would encourage all of you, go to YWCA's website. You can still see or access those learning resources. You know, if you don't know where to start, that's a great place. And I love how they designed it, because it's like, if you have 5 minutes, listen to this podcast. If you've got 10 minutes, read this article. If you've got 15 minutes, do this. And so we can always do something. And having each individual doing their part collectively, we will begin to see that cultural shift.
Thank you very much, Swiling. My one takeaway from this conversation is listen, learn, and lead. And that's all from you, Swiling. Thank you very much for sharing your evening with us. We really appreciate you. Do you have any last words, anything you want to say before we call it a night?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chike. Well, I just want to thank you and Annie for the invitation to be a part of this beautiful platform that you guys have created. And you guys are such excellent models on how to do just that. I listen, I learn, and I lead. And I just love the way that you guys are leading out in our community, hosting these conversations. So thrilled about your move to Washington, D.C. And can't not wait to see your family just thrive in the DMV area. If there's anything I can do to support you, please do not hesitate reaching out. I want to thank everyone else for tuning in. And I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Willing. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
See ya.